What's up, everybody? Welcome to the newest episode of Demo Day, the podcast for entrepreneurs and venture capitalists where we demystify the culture of joining one of the top accelerator, incubator, or VC programs from around the world. I'm your host, Sean Goldfaden, CEO of Coefficient Labs, and on today's episode, we'll be interviewing Brian Garrett, co-founder and managing director at Crosscut Ventures. Today, we'll hear the story of Brian's life and how he turned a personal tragedy, his father passing away when he was only 13, into a lifelong quest to succeed and, more importantly, develop his perspective on happiness. On today's episode, we'll talk about why Brian and the Crosscut team took such a huge bet on the LA ecosystem, what Brian looks for in founders and teams that he invests in, and why it's so important for founders to focus on caring for their whole selves, not just pushing away their personal lives under the rug when they're in the middle of a startup. Also, this is one of our last episodes in season 1 of the Demo Day podcast. If you've been listening to the show, getting value, loving what we're doing here at Coefficient Labs, please go and give us a review over on the Apple Podcast. Again, we're giving away a $10,000 growth hacking package to one lucky person that leaves us a review. Without further ado, let's get into Demo Day. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today on Demo Day.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Brian, the first time that I got to experience Crosscut, we were actually at your LP event. We were working with Nick to take content and sort of capture that experience. And one of the things that really moved me when I was there, within the first couple of minutes, Rick came on and he started talking about your journey and the growth you've had together. And he quite literally was moved to tears at just the impact that the two of you have made. And I found myself just really impressed and moved by that moment. And it wasn't just Rick being emotional, but it was really all of the founders that came on after to talk about, their experience working with Crosscut and how much you guys focus on the health of the founders and the positivity of the mindset and the team. And so I wanted to start this podcast off by, just asking, it's so clear that mentoring and coaching is something that's, really true to your heart. What does being a venture capitalist mean to you, and why have you made it your life work to help founders succeed?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was certainly the driving force for all of us, because for those that know the background story of Crosscut, it was a really difficult first 7-8 years. I was a full-time operator on the side. We had raised a $5 million fund. I was, working 20 hours a day, 3 young kids at home, big mortgage in the Palisades. It wasn't working the way we had envisioned it. And so that struggle and the support network around me that allowed us to get through that leads to really, a deep-seated sense of camaraderie with Rick and Brett and the things that we went through. And, I was surprised to see Rick tear up that day, because usually I'm the one that's crying. And what it did for us, and I sort of describe it as like the DNA of the firm, is, we were the street fighters of LA. Like we started a fund in 2007, 2008. There were really no other new funds emerging in LA at the time, right? Mark Suster showed up a little later and repurposed GRP, but we started this thing from scratch, and we got beat up every step of the way. Like nothing ever seemed to go the way you wanted it. So I think you bring that sense of accomplishment and appreciation for where you came from.
Man, well, I can't wait to talk more about that story and that journey, and we'll definitely get into the early days of Crosscut. But I thought before jumping right in, if we could unwind a little and talk about early days. I think a lot of our viewers that especially someday aspire to be a venture capitalist always, where did this start? Like, have they always been doing this? So where'd you grow up, and what was life like for you in your early days?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up here in Pacific Palisades, west side of LA, between Santa Monica and Malibu. Grew up with an older brother, athletic family. He went off to Stanford to play basketball on a scholarship. This is right around the time that my father passed suddenly. And so I was sort of thrown for a loop on, how do I figure out what I'm all about? And I was a young, accomplished athlete. I picked volleyball. I've said many times, I think it was, 2 months after he passed, I said I wanted to get a scholarship to play volleyball at Stanford. And 5 years later, I did. So it was really growing up on the West Side and good access to education, but really driven by trying to achieve through athletics.
I want to, if you're open to it, Brian, I would love to get a little context on your father and your dad, because I love, his story is really admirable from someone that doesn't know him, but listen to how you explain it. Just for people that, to understand a little bit more, because I think that it's such a driver for you in general. Sure. Who is your pops, and how did he impact the story in your life?
Yeah, I think that's a great point of view on that, is because a lot of people would say, oh, you grew up privileged on the west side of LA and went to a fancy private school. But my father, just one generation before, was the only son of two alcoholic parents. He came up through the foster care program here in Los Angeles, actually grew up out in Laverne, east of LA. Basically was living on a mattress outside of his father's trailer when his father kind of abandoned him for another family, a second wife and a child. And at that moment, he said, screw this, I'm going to go into a foster program where I have resources around me. And the way the story unfolds is he got a full ride scholarship to Laverne University, turned it down because he'd always wanted to go to UCLA. And then in that process, enrolled in UCLA, was a ward of the court, which meant he had to live in group homes. And that group home was in downtown Los Angeles. So he would get up every day, he would take the bus to UCLA, and he worked his way through college being a cosmetic salesman for Max Factor.
Now, what was your relationship? Were very close? How did this moment and experience lead you to go on this path of accomplishment, really?
Yeah. I wish I could say I knew why. So were we close? My memory of him was a very loving, supportive father. He was so proud of my brother and I, and was the dad in the top row with the VHS camera filming every basketball game that we ever played in, often yelling at the refs aggressively. And
walking up and down.
Yeah, I mean, he was a 6'8", 350-pound giant human being. Wow. And so I was scared of him, but he was loving and warm and just really fun. Like, he sold his real estate business, kind of crumbled. He bought a travel agency. He didn't want to fly airplanes anymore because he couldn't have beers. So he bought a boat, and we used to go out boating in the harbor. Like, he was wanted to be a man of leisure given the life that he had growing up.
It sounds also like he wouldn't, if they would only say you can go this direction, he would say, no, I would kind of want to go that direction, or he would push the boundaries maybe more than a traditional.
Very unconventional. Absolutely. No framework to look at, in terms of a father figure that he grew up with, so everyone talks about epigenetics. Like, if you think about what he went through as a child and the impact that had, or the imprint that it had on his DNA, and then the way he wanted to maybe come into parenting with a different framework. It's a pretty amazing story to not have the trauma of his life spread into the way he parented and have him parent me that way. So he went 180 degrees the other way, which I'm quite thankful for.
Now, how did that, I guess how is the wrong word, but can you remember what your mindset was like? I could imagine that there's a sort of bucket that is, sadness and hurt and anger and all of these emotions, but there's also the bucket that sort of leads to, questioning what you want to do. So do you remember what your mindset was like and how you overcame that obstacle?
Yeah. In the weirdest way, my coping mechanism, was to basically create a life of achievement. And it served me very well in that moment. I mean, I was back in school 4 days later. How many 13-year-old kids are like, I'm fine, let's go back to school. I gotta take that science test. I did. And looking back, it's very awkward and unique and probably not healthy. And I think it's led to some of the damage that I, view in terms of the way I've evolved as a human now, was using that shield and that sense of like, well, I'll just achieve to feel better, or I'll achieve to make him be proud of me. Those are very natural ways to handle tragedy, but I don't think they're healthy ways. And back then, I mean, this is 1986. I don't think anyone ever looked at me and said, that kid's going to have problems down the road, or we need to get him therapy. I never went and saw a therapist after my father passed. I just went back to school and I started grinding. And I realized, a year ago that I've been grinding for 32 years.
Now, I wanted to ask this question because you've had so many years to reflect on this. So knowing what you do now about, talking it out and working with yourself and all of the things around personal development, what advice do you have for founders that deal with these sorts of tragedies? Not, oh, we lost a deal, not, oh, I'm having trouble at home, but something that rocks you to the ground. Is there advice that you can give in those situations?
I think so. I think at the highest level, what Crosscut has become aware of as a partnership is that many entrepreneurs try to bifurcate their selves. There's two selves. There's the entrepreneurial self and there's the personal self, and there's not room for the two of them to coexist.
I'm crushing it. Everything's amazing. And then they're going and talking to peers or therapists, and it's like miserable and I'm barely surviving.
Yes. And so that might be, again, a healthy way to achieve, but I don't think it's a healthy way to be a human being. And my big thing is trying to blur that line and make it one self, one person who can acknowledge how hard being an entrepreneur is, and the struggles that you face, and the depression and the anxiety and all the sense of responsibility that comes from raising capital and trying to hit milestones and please your investors and all these things, with a candor and a vulnerability around the idea that, you can also have a relationship with that investor that says, I'm really struggling right now. And I've said this on a couple of different conversations. I've had entrepreneurs that lost their fiance, lost both their parents, right in the middle of financings, and right in the middle of really, really important moments in their startup's life. And they didn't feel like they could
push it all the way down.
Push it down. And that cannot be healthy long term. There's just no way it can be healthy. And I think I have that realization because I kind of did the same thing. I pushed down my tragedy as my way to manage the sadness of my world. And I just don't think it's a good way to live long term. So
you said something in one of your previous podcasts, which is it's so counter. You say, let the game come to you. As this is this one core now that you let the game come. You can't change these outside circumstances. And at the same time, you have all of these young, hungry entrepreneurs that are saying, Brian, what the hell? Let the game come to me. I got to go. I got to make this happen. So how do you blur that line? And is it completely a single player game, or have you found there to be, ways or tactics that help you?
So I certainly think strong mentors, strong coaches, Crosscut as a partnership, we use coaches, we do offsites, we work on communication frameworks, we work on vision, goal setting, and we have a whole thing that we're doing with evolution coaching here in LA around not just Crosscut, but how we work with our portfolio companies. Myself, I use coaches now. So I use coaches to help me with my North Star vision of what I'm trying to achieve in my role at Crosscut. And I use it for schedule optimization, efficiency of my time, work-life balance. So as an example, I don't take meetings before 10 a.m. That is my time. It's either to catch up on email and be responsive to entrepreneurs, or it's to go surf, right? And that's my choice. But I make sure that my calendar doesn't have stuff unless really necessary before 10 a.m. And then I carve out things in my schedule. So I think coaching frameworks and working with strong mentors and people that are really comfortable in understanding what they're facing and the tools that are available to you to sort of help overcome those obstacles.
And that was amazing. Something that I heard as you were talking about is, I think a lot of entrepreneurs, you roll out of bed, you immediately check your phone, you're immediately in the mix of all of the shit, and that stress or that anxiety comes, and it's like that you're working in the business where one of your tactics, it seems, is you understand that you have to put a 2-hour slot aside that lets you work on your life or on the business, or kind of separate yourself from the craziness.
Sure. For VCs, we have different objectives every single day than an entrepreneur does, but we all have a goal we're trying to achieve. For us, what I have come to realize, or the reason I create this white space time, this time that's for me, whether it's reading. I mean, I was just sitting at the beach reading for the last hour. The reason I do those things is because if you don't, I'll just give you an example from the venture world. You can go down the rat hole of this deal's not working. Why is it not working? I messed up. How do I fix it? And really what you need to do is there's some things you just can't fix. There's some things that were just bad investments. There were some ideas that just didn't hit the market at the right time. And we as a venture firm have to look at the collective body of work, right? So Crosscut has invested in over 100 companies over the last 11 years. If I looked at every single failure and let that be my measurement of who I am as a venture capitalist or an entrepreneur, I'd be pretty sad and pretty lonely. But if you look at the collective outcome of what we've been able to do and how we've helped catalyze Southern California, I can be proud of myself. So you have to be able to step back and see the forest from the trees. And that advice still works with entrepreneurs, right? You can get lost up in a negotiation or a deal that went wrong, or you can look at the collective momentum and direction of the business and the culture you've built and the people you've hired and be like, I'm damn proud of what I built, even if it's not quite working yet.
Coming from a place of gratitude as opposed of like being critical of yourself. Now, I think I'm sure a lot of your drive and success came from the voice you had in your own head in the early days. But I also remember you recalling one specific coach, some war veteran that really had an impact on you. What was the impact he had, and what was it about his coaching style that you have since, leveraged in your own coaching style?
I have not embodied much of his coaching style because I'm still scared to death of that guy. That coach showed up in my life right after my father passed. And so in many ways, if I look back on it, I think I was looking for a father figure. I was looking for a role model and a mentor. And what he brought at that time was a dedication to craft, a commitment to physicality, strength training, hard work, a real dedication to the sport. And, it was at a time where I said, well, how do I manage the tragedy of my dad's death? Oh, I'm going to get a scholarship to play volleyball at Stanford. And he was like, well, I'll show you the path. And so like anyone, hook, line, and sinker, I was all in, whether his framework was right or not. Now, what he was preaching was, honestly, like no sex, no drugs, you have to get up and be in the gym. You have to work harder than everyone else. I wasn't the most talented. It was sort of like, we're going to teach you to work harder to achieve your goals. And I bought into it. I didn't have an alternative, right? It was what I needed at that time. And he created a moral compass for how I manage the things in high school that come your way. And it really kept me on track. I just had a real clear vision of what I wanted to do. And no one ever tried to convince me otherwise. So I just put my head down and did it.
What advice do you have for other people in your position on how they can mentor others? Because I feel like, there's so many millions of men and women that grow up without a father or mother in their early age, and they can go down so many bad pathways. And it tends to be having those figures in your life that are sort of redirecting. Any pieces of advice for other leaders or VCs like yourself that are starting to take on more mentees or younger founders or people in their life?
Well, I think that's one of the things I love about the Southern California tech ecosystem. All of my peers at all the funds that we work with here in LA, they tend to take a really positive approach to their role and the importance of how they interact with the entrepreneurs. I don't think the industry as a whole does a great job of that, but I do think that the Southern California VC ecosystem does, and the accelerators that are all around it. I think we all understand that it's more than a business model and hitting your KPIs. So I think if you're starting out and you've got an entrepreneurial vision, it's always about surrounding yourself with people, but people that aren't just about the metrics. They're about the nuances of how all this has come together to allow you to achieve the metrics.
So I think everyone is excited here. You did accomplish your dream of getting into Stanford. What was the transition like for you going from high school where you had this coach that's on your ass and everything is so kind of structured. Now you're moving into college. Did you know immediately you wanted to go into business, or was sports your passion? Where were you back in Stanford?
Yeah, so I think when I got there, I had an imposter syndrome dynamic. I didn't feel like I belonged. I was a good student. Wasn't a great student. Volleyball got me in, and I've always known that, and I have no issue with that. And so when I got there, I think I had watched my father with really what you could be called an entrepreneurial career. Cosmetic salesman into real estate development without any capital. He had to go raise the capital deal by deal. Everything he did was kind of, an idea that he wanted to go off and execute, and it worked out for a while until he passed. So I think I was oriented towards business, but for no particular reason except just watching my father. Stanford doesn't have a business degree, so you either come in and you take an economics degree. And I had a friend, again, just talk about timing. I show up and he goes, you should do industrial engineering. I didn't even know what that was. But he's like, it's 130 units and econ's 40 and you're going to get your butt kicked. And I said, okay. And so that was the next goal, right? So I had already gotten there with the volleyball thing. I still had goals within volleyball itself, but that was the next thing that I put my head down. I said, okay, I'm going to get an industrial engineering degree. And I had to do the engineering core, and I had to take hardcore chemistry and physics and all these things that were way above my intelligence level. And I did it. And I didn't get great grades at Stanford, but I walked out of there with an industrial engineering degree.
When you were there, did Stanford have the same, technology energy about it, or was it, not as much of that scene back then?
Not even close. Yeah, not even close. I mean, the types of programs that they've put in place now that are breeding entrepreneurship are off the charts. When I was there, in fact, industrial engineering doesn't even exist anymore. They changed the name, and it's really more an entrepreneurial oriented. Mine was about factory optimization and throughput and safety stock. It was like looking at production lines and trying to figure out how to squeeze more out of it. That's what industrial engineering was about. Not terribly useful to me in my career at all, right? But when my volleyball career ended, and I had to go get a job, I walked into Silicon Valley and I started interviewing, and it was basically like, oh, you have an industrial engineering degree from Stanford and you were captain of the volleyball team. We want to talk to you. And that was it. I mean, there was no real work experience behind that. All I had ever done was play volleyball. I played with the U.S. junior national team. I traveled every summer. I was always playing volleyball. That's not how kids come out of school these days. They've already started 3 companies by the time they graduate Stanford. I had nothing. I had delivered airline tickets for my mom's travel agency. Literally.
And so once you started your first job, how do you transition from, working your very first job out of school to saying, there's a tech boom that's happening and I want to be a part of it?
Yeah. So my first job was in Palo Alto at a strategy consulting firm. Think of it as like a McKinsey or Bain knockoff.
Okay.
Group called RB Weber. A guy named Jeff Weber founded it. He was one of the original founders of Sybase, or the original investors in Sybase, the first database company. And it was 1995. So when I look back on the success I had at RB Weber, it had nothing to do with my industrial engineering background, right? I had to learn how to research markets. I had to do customer interviews, pricing studies. I had to write business plans. I cut my teeth doing some amazing work right when that first internet bubble started. And I just stumbled into it. The skill set, in retrospect, was more about my communication style, my leadership skill set, my ability to articulate ideas. That's what led to my success in that first job. Nothing to do with safety stock analysis. I mean, I was like an Excel guru. I built big models. So what? Anyone can learn that. My skill set was in my ability to sit down with people and glean answers and put it into a format that was helpful to the client.
Now, did your quote unquote work ethic pull through college and then into business? Have you always been, working crazy hours, or how did that mentality of being a athlete transition into the business world for you?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I tell my kids all the time, I've never been the smartest or the most talented at any of the things that I've done with my life. I've always been willing to work harder. So you could take that through that first job at RB Weber. I wouldn't say I worked that hard in business school. That was sort of a break to have some fun and meet some great people. But then when I met Rick, when I moved back down to Southern California in 2001 and got hired at Palomar, it was back to this, what is this discipline of venture capital? And one of the biggest things is being extremely interested in learning. And so I just consumed massive amounts of content on markets and technologies and things that really were going to try to help me understand how technology evolves and what types of businesses could emerge as the new standards and big outcomes.
How did you start working with Rick to begin with?
Yeah, same thing. I finished my MBA, and I had looked at my work as a consultant, and then a lot of that client work, we started taking equity in exchange for fees. And so the RB Weber Group put together a fund eventually, but we were early on in deals like, no one will remember these companies, but Commerce One and Broadbase and Inktomi. These were bubble high flyers. They went public. They were worth $7-8 billion, and they were worth nothing. 12 months later.
Wow.
We were doing the work for those startups, writing business plans for them, and so I saw what the entrepreneurial machine could be, and I was really enamored with it. And then what I loved about consulting is I loved having a couple clients or a couple projects going on every time. So I have found that I'm not great at doing one thing over and over and over again. I'm not a great operator. I'm better at having 5 or 6 or 8 investment relationships or projects and being able to drop in and think strategically with people. So that's why venture was like the perfect balance of that. So you have the financial upside of getting it right and the fun of getting it right. And then you also get to work with really interesting people who are driven to get up every single day and go build something.
So one of the questions I had, because I think before you, did you go to Costa Rica before your MBA or after your MBA? When you took, I think you called it your quarter life crisis.
Yeah, that was before I even applied to business school. So I had been out of school for about 4 years and had been grinding at that firm RB Weber. So it was long hours. It was a lot of work.
So I would assume, and this might be wrong, but that while the Costa Rica quarter life crisis might be this one major event, you've done a lot of these kind of mini retreats where you're doing soul searching and thinking about yourself and your life and your future. So one of the questions I had is, when you take these sabbaticals, obviously there's no right or wrong way of doing it, but in your own individual experience, do you have routines or sort of a style that you kind of to put yourself in that sort of mindset, or what are those like for you when you go?
Yeah, so I don't have a set routine. I don't have a set time frame of when I do them. I really take advantage of the rare situations where I'm like, you know what, this is one of those times where I can do it. So when I look back on the way I do them is I try to just simplify my life. I think I suffer from an overly complex life. It's one I created. It's 3 children under 16. It's building a firm from scratch. It's all the things that I've done. And
so many founders.
Yeah, and I chose to build this life, so it's on me. But when I get to a place where I'm a bit overwhelmed or I just find time to be able to take a break, I just try to dumb it down. So Costa Rica is like, I just want to surf and journal. I'm 24 years old and I have no idea what I want to do with my life. And I've only done this one thing and I've just been grinding for these years. Let's just take a little break and just surf as much as I can. And that was 30 days and it was great. This one that I took last summer, that was, I turned 45, Crosscut hit its 10-year anniversary. It was time to step off the proverbial hamster wheel and really reassess everything, right? Because I've had health problems along the way. I've had things that have happened in my life where I would just plow through them because I had no choice or because I was super focused on a task at hand, like raising a fund so that I could take care of my family. I finally got to a place where I felt like Crosscut was in a good spot and I was in a spot where I could say, why don't we take a little break here and simplify? And so as I've said on some other conversations, I dropped into the family minivan with a mattress, a golf bag, and a fly fishing pole.
Wow.
Right. And I'm not off the grid per se, but I'm kind of off the grid. I mean, I still have a phone, I still check in, I still take care of some basic things, but I'm out in the middle of nature just trying to get rooted in what really matters in this life. And I think that's what we all suffer from. We all tend to deviate away from what really matters because we get caught up in some routine or some idea that we can't shake ourselves from.
Yeah, or I would imagine too, just that those things adjust over time. 10 years ago, what mattered to you right then as the most is probably different than today what matters the most.
Absolutely.
So going back to Palomar, one of the things that I remember you had talked about, they kind of put you on this 2-year plan, sort of like, we're going to bring you in, we're going to train you, we're going to get you all set up, and then we're going to push you out on your way to do your thing. But you ended up being there for 5+ years, and they ended up making you a partner. So one of the questions I have, there's a lot of principals or early LPs that listen to this show that are saying to themselves, like, I want to be like Brian someday, like I want to be the head of my fund. What advice do you have for early associates to climb through the ranks of their VC fund to make partner?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the toughest questions in the venture world, right? Because every partnership's different. The reality of our business, and I always talk about this way, is look, there's a finite pie. The size of your fund and the return dollars that you generate is the pie. And to become a partner means you're getting a larger piece of that pie. The only way to do that is to generate massive returns on the dollars that you've invested on behalf of those partners. You have to make yourself invaluable. So if you've put X dollars to work and it returned 5 times that amount, you've just made those partners a lot of money. You then have all the leverage to basically say, you know what, I want to be like you because I just made you a bunch of dough. And their alternative is to say, well, we don't need you, but you just made them a bunch of dough. So they have to find that balance. It's ruthless. It really is. But that is the framework. It's like, you work so hard to start and build something, and then somebody else wants in, and you have to truly believe that their additive benefits are going to make the pie bigger, right? And that's exactly what we did with Clinton, our fourth partner. So non-co-founder of the fund, it was the 3 of us. We had looked at a bunch of gaming deals, including Riot, and passed on Brandon. Why did we pass? Well, Brett, Rick, and myself were not gamers. We didn't know what a MOBA was. We didn't know there was a chance to take an old MOBA and turn it into a new modern MOBA. And Brandon didn't really have any background in it. So we looked at that and we're like, and he was raising $5 million to get halfway through game development, and we were a $5 million fund.
Right.
But we look back on all that and we're like, we need somebody with that DNA that understands where gaming is going. It's such a critical foundation of Los Angeles. And we were introduced to Clinton. And so we said, look, we're going to bring you in and we will make room in this pie. We will cut you a slice of this pie if you can go off and develop a line of business for us that we would not be able to develop on our own. And we think it's critical, and thus it's worth the risk.
Meaning that, money talks and bullshit walks. Like, everyone can work hard, everyone can put that in, but if you really want to move through the ranks, it comes through bringing more to that pie and making sure that the whole fund is getting bigger.
Yeah. So for young associates or principals, it's either deal sourcing that turn into successes, or it's thesis generation and owning a particular area that is critical to the fund, where they say, I don't want to have to go find someone else with that domain expertise or that deep knowledge of a category, so I will make you the partner that owns that category.
Got it.
Then you become invaluable to the partnership, and they all then believe collectively we can grow the pie. Right now, we're in an interesting spot where the one way to grow the pie is raise more money. We don't want to be a larger fund. We think the 125, 150, 150 million is the sweet spot to be a great seed stage investor focused on the Southern California ecosystem. If you start to go much bigger, you look like an A-round fund and you're competitive with Silicon Valley and Upfront and Greycroft and March Capital, and we don't want to compete there. We want to be the Switzerland of LA, and we want to work with the pre-seed funds. We want to work with the incubators and the accelerators. We want to work with Silicon Valley. We want to be the firm that has their tentacles everywhere in LA and is really a facilitator of good stuff.
That's awesome. So back to the days of Palomar, you start working there and you get your chance to meet Rick. I've always been curious about what was it about Rick, or what were the traits about Rick that made you want to partner with him? Because at that point in your life, you could have done a lot of different things. You could have started your own business or joined a different fund. So what was it about Rick that made you want to partner with him?
That's a kind softball question. It wasn't nearly that glamorous. I needed a job And so my wife, she was my fiance at the time. She had been laid off from her first .com after she finished business school. And I was unemployed at the end of my MBA. And we were tired of Silicon Valley. The bubble had burst. We'd been living in San Francisco. I grew up surfing and playing volleyball. I wasn't doing much of that. We didn't want to go to Tahoe every weekend and sit in 5 hours of traffic. We didn't hike Mount Tam. I didn't mountain bike. We were basically like, we can go anywhere we want right now. We have no strings. Where do we want to start our life together? And my wife, Elisa, was UCLA undergrad and grad. And we're like, well, let's just go back to LA. So once that intention was set, then it was like, well, what do we do? And so I went to my professor and I said, I want to do venture in Southern California. And he laughed me out of the room. He's like, there is no venture in Southern California. But he made 3 introductions to Mission down in San Diego, which is no longer there. Red Point, which was Brad Jones, legend here in LA, but no longer active on behalf of Red Point, and Jim Gower and Rick at Palomar. So they were the only one that was actually hiring. I can't say I was like enamored with Rick at the time. I just needed a job. I was coming down here. I was getting married. I needed a job. Now, what developed from there, that fund, if you look back on it, it was really built around Jim Gower's persona as an enterprise IT investor that understood the plumbing of Global 2000 businesses. The problem was there wasn't a lot of that happening in Southern California. So I was on the plane chasing deals up in Silicon Valley and Texas and Colorado. And Rick was the newest GP to that partnership. And we developed kind of a kinship around being the young guys that were hustling and trying to help build the brand and reputation. And we cared about the fact that we wanted to do deals here and we couldn't get any deals through the partnership because they weren't enterprise IT.
What do you believe are the strengths that Rick brings to the fund that maybe you don't bring?
Oh, yeah. So that's exactly when I look back on Palomar not working out and us conceptualizing Crosscut, that decision to start a fund with Brett and Rick was mostly rooted in a very firm belief that these were good human beings that had alignment in what we wanted our life to look like, the way we wanted to go about doing our business, the moral compass and how we wanted to treat people. You can cross certain lines in this business. You can take advantage of entrepreneurs, negotiate certain ways, and we never wanted to do that. It's always been founder first, and it's always been as a service provider to the entrepreneurial community. That was the framework of what we wanted to build. We wanted to be of service to LA Tech. So that framework, plus a fire in our bellies to go do this because we still had something to prove, and a general kinship on like, well, are we good partners for this? What he brings complementary to me, I think he is, most people would say he's more pessimistic about businesses, market sizes. He's very analytical, so he wants quantitative data. Whereas maybe Brett and I are a little bit more gut instinct. Like we just have a gut feel about a product needed in a certain market, and he'll say, "Well, quantify it. Let's go figure that out." So that combination of me being very optimistic about entrepreneurs and ideas, and then him come saying, "Well, wait a second," we think has brought the conversation back to a level where you end up making better decisions as a partnership.
So my next question, and you kind of just answered it, is I was going to ask, what advice do you have for other employees that are working together that are deciding they want to partner up and start their own thing? It sounds like what you're talking about is complementary, traits that you have to be complementary. Your weaknesses have to be their strengths. Do you have anything else you want to add toward that?
Well, I don't think founders spend enough time really getting to know each other, taking it 2-3 layers deeper than where are you from, what's your background, what have you done in your past. I think you really have to go to the true core of the self, what motivates you, what expectations you have around your life, what's driving you to do this stuff, and take it to a whole nother level. And so I urge early on, and we're starting to do more of this in partnership with Evolution, is founder assessments before we get involved with our dollars. Let's try to figure out what is this founder dynamic between these two, and is it a healthy one? And does it have traits that we think can scale? Because if you think about it, 80% of an investment success is really about the execution of the idea with the founding team. If I end up in a situation where I have to replace a founder quickly, or they have a breakup, very unlikely that that company is going to get back on the right track.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the landscape of the LA ecosystem when you first started versus where we're at now? And maybe you can even start by talking about the difficulty that it was for you to actually get through your first fund. I love the story, how for you it felt like it was a slam dunk. You want to talk a little bit about what that experience was like for your very first fund at Crosscut?
Sure. I think everyone's a little bit blind to that 2008 2011 timeframe and how difficult it was. Most of the people that are active in LA tech today weren't here before 2011. So, this story is kind of like, well, it is my revisionist history, I fully acknowledge. But, Rick and I had track record. We had put $40 million to work each. We had multiples on those dollars in realized returns. Brett was the iconic entrepreneur that sold Intermix Media to News Corp for $700 million. Three of us came together on this idea that LA was about the convergence of tech and media. And we wanted to start a fund when there were no other funds in LA focused on LA entrepreneurship, LA tech. That idea should have had legs. It should have been backable. But for some reason, at that time, as the market started to implode with the recession and Lehman and everything that was coming, the LPs that we were talking to were like, well, you guys were enterprise IT investors and now you want to do tech and media. So they didn't give us any credit for our past track records. And so in a lot of ways, we had to reinvent ourselves. Crosscut was a complete reinvention of the personas that Rick and I had established in our years of doing Palomar. And I look at it now and, when we failed miserably in getting institutional interest as the world was imploded. And so we ended up going to 10, 12 LA tech entrepreneurs and said, do you like the idea of a fund focused on LA? You built successes here in LA. Wouldn't you like us to be that central hub of three GPs running around and you as the extended legs of our network? And that led to the $5 million that we raised.
Wow. So your goal was to raise, how big was 50 million dollars, and and it ended up being a $5 million.
Yeah.
So in the earliest days, how did you guys set up the criteria for who you would fund? Was it a collaboration amongst all of you? Was it a central thesis?
No thesis. Always been a consensus partnership. The very first deal we ever did was personal money into Jason Nazar at DocStock.
That's a good bet.
Right. And that was the three of us sitting around kind of saying, I've said this before, is like, I didn't have a passion for documents, but Jason did. And we believed in Jason.
He's a pretty energetic dude.
Force of nature. But his background, he was like a ventriloquist and a public speaker. And, and he had a very untraditional background before law school at Pepperdine. So you wouldn't have looked at it on paper and be like, that's an entrepreneur I have to back. But we spent enough time with him to say, this is the guy we want to take a risk on. Second entrepreneur we backed was Ophir Tanz at GumGum. He and his co-founder at that time, Ari Mir, their previous business was a wallpaper business, not remotely indicative of what they were trying to build at GumGum. And now GumGum is multi-$100 million ad tech business that he scaled from scratch.
So, understanding that you're a little bit more by the gut, Rick is a little bit more analytical. Do you have qualities that you look for that kind of tie all of your founders together? Or what are the similarities or traits that you see in the founders that really make the distance together?
This sounds, obvious, but it's really for all of our deals, it's like a driving passion behind the idea. I spend more time trying to understand why they feel the need to go spend their life trying to build this thing than almost any other part of my conversation, truthfully.
Wow.
Right?
How come?
Because I just think you can't fake passion around an idea. Like I've seen so many, and I was sort of guilty of it actually. I mean, if I look at Style Saint, my startup that I was running, luckily Allison had the passion and the vision and the real driving energy behind it. But I was sort of I'm an MBA and I have a thesis about a market and this is where I think e-commerce is going. And I probably wouldn't have done it on my own, but I probably could have gotten that idea funded, and it wouldn't have been a passion-driven thing. It would have been a macro thesis-driven male MBA approach to an opportunity in a market. And so I just think you have to have that passion. You have to have that story that says, well, I did this and then this didn't happen, and I think this is what's needed in the market. And I am 100% convinced that I'm the person to build it.
That's amazing. And there's another saying that you said, I know I'm going to butcher it. You can help me here. Pessimism of intellect, optimism of
the will.
Optimism of the will. What does that mean exactly?
So I think it's the right balance in a founder persona that we look for. So you want them to be crazy optimistic. The world is mine. I'm going to take that mountain. We used to say, climb Everest without supplemental oxygen, right? Without the tanks. You're just like, I'm going and nothing's going to stop me. But many people, that doesn't work. Then in essence, they're almost crazy or overly convinced they're right without balancing and having enough self-awareness to look at the realities of a market or the realities of a competitive dynamic. So that's the pessimism. We like to see both, right? And I think that's how we've built our partnership. Right. So we brought that together through the DNA of the 4 partners so that we can look at opportunities and assess risk and reward and what we're willing to do with the capital we have. Well, we look at the same thing in the entrepreneurs, whether it's a single founder or a team. It's sort of like, you got to have that one crazy, passionate guy or gal that's like, this is it and I know I'm right. And then you have to someone whispering in their ear, like, what if you're wrong? What do we do if you're wrong?
What are your thoughts on pitches? This podcast is called Demo Day because there's been such a culture around going through a program and then there's this big demo day and it's this one moment where everyone gets to come. And while I think that this podcast is more about uncovering stories like yourself and, teaching founders and VCs the ups and the downs, at the end of the day, a lot of your business comes down to a 1 minute to 30-minute pitch. And so when you see great pitches that really stick with you, or you go home at night and you tell your wife about, wow, I just met this great company, what is it about that pitch that really sticks out to you?
Usually it's the energy of the founder and the confidence in the direction they're heading. I take that back to the founder story. Like I really do emphasize that. It's kind of like, tell me why you want to take this chunk of your life to go do this, because there's lots of things you can go do, right? So why are you the right person to go do this? And what do you see about this market that no one else sees? Because ideas are kind of a commodity, if you really think about it, right? It's about the execution of the idea, and that's usually driven by some little insight that's slightly different than the other entrepreneur that's trying it. And that's really hard to pick up or figure out, and so that's why we're wrong most of the time, right? That's why most of our ventures fail. But that's what we're looking for. We're trying to just understand, like, what is it uniquely about you and the experience that you've had that has led to this insight about why this business should exist and how you can bring it to scale. That in a nutshell is all that matters. Everything else is table stakes, to be honest, right? How you analyze your TAM, how you think about your business model, how you go to market, what's your competitive. So those are all things that you can learn in an accelerator. But I don't think you can learn to articulate the driving force behind the innovative thinking that you have that makes it worthy of capital. That's not something that can be taught.
Which I think, I think it was Anna Barber that came and said it, focusing on the problem, not on the solution. That if you can spend more and more time understanding the problem, why is this problem so important to you? The solutions will keep changing and iterating, but the problem itself is where the focus should be around.
For sure. That's well said.
So, there's a lot of founders, myself included, that have thought a lot about going to Evolution. I've worked for other startups where they've gone through that program. When you meet someone that maybe they come to you and they're talking to you about their business and what's going on, and you say, you should go check out Evolution. Can you talk a little bit about what is Evolution and why has this program been such a part of the DNA now of Crosscut?
Yeah. So again, it was a very personal journey for me a year ago on a retreat that Evolution hosted. But I had gotten to know Matt and Jeff before that, and I'd probably been speaking to them about what I felt was the importance of breeding more vulnerability into the Southern California tech ecosystem. Right, just less of the bro culture, less of the I'm killing it culture, and more of let's have real conversations about what's really going on, right? And this is when we were losing some of our entrepreneurs to suicide, and we were watching all these tragedies happen around us. And I said, why is this stuff not being talked about? Because this is real life.
Yeah.
And so my personal experience at the retreat in Maui and the conversations I'd had with Jeff and Matt about how can we bring more scale to some of the frameworks that they're looking at around this concept of the hero's journey and how you face the deepest, darkest parts of yourself to, resurface and rise again and be a better you. And at the end of the day, that's not only important for an entrepreneur, that's important for everyone. Like why everyone should have this framework of let's break myself down and figure out how I can come back and be better than I was in my last iteration.
I have like all these different images in my head. Are we talking like Tony Robbins, thousands of people in a room? Are we, what is this?
Very one-on-one. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. So Evolution, it's Evolution. It's a large platform. There are many coaches all over the US that are Evolution coaches. There are individual coaches that have decided to align around this shared vision and this collective platform. And really they can do anything you need from a coaching framework. Public speaking help, if you need that, if you struggle with that and you have to go raise money, they can come in and teach you how to present better, eye contact, various things like that. But they also do a lot of 360 reviews. So CEO needs to understand how are they perceived by the people in their company? What are their leadership weaknesses? Where can they improve? For us, it's taking it down to the, what are the stories that you have told yourself your whole life that are maybe holding you back? And how do you break through those stories of who you think you are to be a different you, right? And again, for me, it was, my framework in life was head down, grind mindset, achieve. Everything I did was what's the next thing I'm trying to achieve or build. And that, again, served me very well. But at 45 years old, with some health problems and feedback from my partners and from my wife, I was maybe a bit aloof, a bit unapproachable, a bit too transactional, a bit caught up in my own shit. And I didn't have the wherewithal to see that. I just thought I was doing what I do. And so I started to try to piece it together. I was like, well, is that because of my dad's death? And did I ever mourn his death? And then why am I the way I am? And most importantly, do I want to be that way? And the answer was no. Like I want to be joyful. I don't want to be unapproachable. I want to radiate love and goodness into this ecosystem. I want to have great relationships with all of my founders. I don't want to be caught up in how are you doing? Like instead of saying, how is the business doing? Now I say, how are you doing? And it's a subtle thing, but it's important.
Yeah.
It means I care actually more about you than I do the success of your business. But when I started Crosscut, I cared about the goddamn success of the business because I was trying to take care of my family and I had to raise the next fund. And I had all this pressure that I created for myself that I don't think is necessary now as I move in, as we invest fund 4 and move into our next fund.
I don't even know if there's an answer to this, but how can you go from that state to this where you are now, which is like, zened out, Brian, hanging here, like what was that transformation like for you to see the other side as not being like this? Because if you're an overachiever, always going 110, the opposite of that almost feels like 0. But if you look at it from a different perspective, that is the new 110. So, how do you balance that for yourself?
Well, I think the realization that I had was I wasn't really happy, right? So if I was extremely happy with the way my life had played out and the way I was connecting with people and the relationships and the friendships, then there would be no reason to reassess and alter, right? I think a lot of people look at Crosscut or look at me and be like, he's got it figured out, but I didn't, right? I didn't know how to stop the way I was acting and behaving and the grind is I don't know another way to say it. The grind was not healthy for the way I was showing up at the end of the day to be present with my kids. The way that I was able to sit down and look my wife in the eyes and be like, how are you today? Because my head was off somewhere else. And so these are things that you have to kind of hit a bottom of and say, that's not how I want to be, to rebuild yourself. And I say that from the framework of like all entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah.
Like we all get caught up in the thing we're trying to do. And I think you have to hit the pause button every now and then and say, well, is my North Star objective still the one that I set out on X number of years ago?
This is awesome, Brian. For the startups that maybe have never heard of Crosscut before, and maybe they're moving from the East Coast coming to the West Coast, how would you describe Crosscut just from a more high level? And what would be the best way for a startup like that to get in contact with someone like you or the team?
Yeah, so we're I know you've talked to a lot of incubators and accelerators. We are not that. We are a seed stage fund. Our origin is in supporting Southern California. That's how we set off to raise the fund, but we've never wanted to be a geo fund only. So I would say 2/3 of our deals are LA deals. 1/3 is other geographies, and we'll invest anywhere. We are a traditional seed fund. So usually the time to approach us is, after an incubator or an accelerator run, a little bit of product market fit, some validation that the problem you're solving is worth solving. And we are, we think, a good product and platform for, a $3 million seed round. And we'll do 1.5 to 2 million of that and then help you fill out the rest of the round. And what we hope to be the thing that we are known for and do well is we want to be the best seed to Series A investors, starting in Southern California and then at the national level. And really what that means is we sit down with entrepreneurs, we define the milestones that will lead to success. We work our butts off to help you achieve them on more than just hitting your KPIs, but obviously hitting those metrics that attract Silicon Valley money. And then we walk you into the Valley to all the funds we know, and we help drive that next 5, 10, $20 million round.
Brian, if people wanted to reach out to you on the socials or email, what's the best way to get in contact with you or stay in touch?
Sure. So I think we're not very active on this stuff, but it's all changing now. We've just hired a new director of marketing, and Nick Kim, our head of platform, are really trying to more establish our presence and our voice as a firm. We've been kind of under the radar for a long time. So it's at Crosscut VCs, I think our Twitter handle. Most of us are, first name at crosscut.vc is the way to reach us with ideas. The best way to reach us is honestly through trusted resources, friends, people that say, hey, Brian, you should take a look at this. We get a lot of over the transom stuff. We try to be responsive, but it's hard. It's a lot of deals coming in. There's a lot of activity around here. So best way to really reach us is get an introduction to one of the partners or one of our team members and say, I think this entrepreneur is interesting. They got a good idea.
This has been an amazing, vulnerable, exciting episode of Demo Day. Brian, thank you so much for coming down to RHQ. I'm Sean Goldfaden from Coefficient Labs. This is Demo Day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Next on Demo Day. Wait, I'm gonna be the last episode? I'm gonna be the last episode.